Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a quieter, frost-bitten corner of history. So if you haven't already, settle into your favorite chair, dim the lights, maybe tuck a blanket around your shoulders. We're going to take it slow because tonight the world is not in a hurry, and neither are we. Think of this as a gentle stroll through the past, where the royals weren't quite as polished as the portraits would have you believe. Picture a single wooden home in the dead of winter. The kind that creaks when the wind sighs through its eaves, the kind where 12 people are trapped by snowdrifts so high that leaving isn't really an option. Inside, they huddle together, burning furniture for warmth, sleeping fully dressed because stripping down would simply be foolish. Their faces are pale, the air smells faintly of smoke and damp wool, and yet somehow they are still very concerned about who is next in line to inherit anything. Because, of course, they are royals. In this cold and confined place, we begin our exploration of history's quirks, its delicate misfortunes, and its slightly absurd elites. We'll start with the French Bourbons, who were not particularly practical when it came to survival, family planning, or, frankly, anything beyond etiquette. Louis XIV, for instance, famously called the Sun King, was a man who loved routine, lavishly uncomfortable clothes, and the smell of his own perfume. His court was a delicate ecosystem of intrigue and exhaustion, where nobles practiced the delicate art of fainting whenever someone more powerful sneezed in their direction. Louis himself had an unusual hobby for a king. He enjoyed making people wait. Not in a polite, organized fashion, but in a way that tested their ability to stand still and wonder whether the king actually knew they existed. And he reigned for 72 years because, apparently, patience in others is vastly more enjoyable than in oneself. Now, Louis had a curious obsession with producing heirs. Largely because dynastic continuity was considered essential, he might have had more luck consulting a particularly witty coin toss. The resulting family tree became complicated. His children and grandchildren were, in turns, sickly, spoiled, or mildly confused, a combination that historians describe gently as genetically complicated. Cousin marriages were standard, and these unions often produced what we might politely call peculiar health issues. One of his grandsons, Louis the Dauphin, had a childhood that could be described as both tragic and absurd. He was often sick, partly due to the charming practice of keeping children heavily swaddled and separate from fresh air. His education involved endless lessons in Latin, fencing, and etiquette, which might have made him both refined and exhausted. Had he survived the rampant illnesses of the court? He did not. And his father, Louis XV, eventually inherited the throne with a body slightly less resilient than a porcelain teacup in a drafty room. Let's drift over to another royal disaster, Marie Antoinette, who was French by marriage and Austrian by birth, which naturally caused endless gossip. She had a taste for dresses, pastries, and outrageously impractical hairstyles, which, while visually impressive, did little to improve France's food shortages. Marie Antoinette's life is particularly illustrative of how royals can be completely out of step with reality, even when surrounded by advisors desperately trying to keep them informed. She was young, sheltered, and endlessly criticized, often for things she did not, in fact, do. She was nicknamed Madame Deficit for spending habits that were, historically speaking, mildly irresponsible and, in some ways, inevitable given the expectations of Versailles. Her children, like so many in these dynastic circles, suffered from fragile constitutions, which is another polite way of saying they were frequently sick, weak, or anxious. Royal parenting in this era was conducted with great formality and minimal warmth, so the combination of delicate health and distant parenting made for a very quiet, slightly tragic household. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the British royals were quietly practicing their own brand of dysfunction. George III, for instance, known to posterity as the Mad King, was not actually constantly mad. But he did have episodes of illness that could best be described as inconveniently dramatic, particularly for those attempting to govern a growing empire. His bouts of mental instability led to long periods where Parliament effectively ran the country, because naturally, leaving a king to his whims is never a practical option. His family life, too, was a gentle tragedy. George and Queen Charlotte had 15 children. 15. It is impossible to imagine the logistics alone. 15 royal children, all requiring clothes that could survive the occasional sneeze of smallpox, tutors who believed in the rigorous application of Latin conjugations, and a household staff large enough to maintain a small country. And yet somehow the family managed to survive mostly intact, though not without minor and not-so-minor scandals, illnesses, and endless petty squabbles over precedence. And while we're drifting through these tales of fragile bloodlines and lavish impracticality, it's worth noting the oddities of inbreeding. Royals often married cousins to keep it in the family, which, in theory, sounded like a clever idea. In practice, it produced a variety of slightly unfortunate outcomes. Charles II of Spain, for instance, was so inbred that his jaw alone could have been a cautionary exhibit in a museum. He had multiple health issues, limited mobility, and a life that was tragically short, all courtesy of generations of well-intentioned but misguided dynastic planning. His advisors and family members, naturally, saw this as both a personal and political problem, though few had any practical suggestions besides. Let's try not to make it worse, which historically was almost impossible. So here we are, sitting in this cozy, imaginary snowbound house, surrounded by the echoes of these royal absurdities. Children swaddled too tightly, kings fainting from the minor stress of governance, queens criticized for baking pies that were slightly too sweet. And yet somehow life continued, year after year, snowfall after snowfall, in these strange, delicate worlds of etiquette, illness, and occasional melodrama. From here, we can meander into other corners of European royalty. For instance, the Habsburgs, who were the absolute masters of marrying themselves into continuous genetic complexity. They perfected the art of cousin marriage with a level of dedication that would impress any genealogist and terrify any doctor. Their motto, if one were to translate it into modern advice, might be something like, if it works once, try it again and again and again and again, until someone notices the jawline. But before we wander that far, let's take a moment to appreciate the smaller absurdities. Royal habits often bordered on ritualistic. There were kings who insisted on being bathed at very specific times of day, queens who could not tolerate the sight of peas in their soup, princes who would arrange their shoes in precise geometrical patterns each morning, and the staff, the endlessly patient staff, were expected to accommodate every whim while maintaining absolute discretion. One could argue that, for these servants, the challenge of surviving a winter without setting fire to the royal wardrobe might have been just as difficult as the political machinations outside. So, as the snow presses against the windows and the fire sputters softly, we can lean back and let these tales float past. Royals are rarely heroic in the ways we expect, but they are endlessly fascinating in their fragility, their vanity, and their occasional glimpses of competence. We can observe them gently, like curiosities behind glass, without needing to rush, without needing to solve any problems, because tonight we are merely drifting. And from this, we can begin to move to slightly stranger examples, slightly darker corridors of history, where the fragility of bloodlines and the absurdity of courtly life combine into something almost surreal. Imagine a child, swaddled and coughing, waiting for a parent to glance their way. Imagine a king pacing a chamber, entirely convinced that the fate of the world rests on his choice of gloves. And imagine just for a moment that you are there, quietly observing, breathing slowly, letting these small historical oddities lull you toward a calmer state of awareness. Because after all, that is what history does best sometimes. It lets us look at people who were, in many ways, much more stressed, confused, and human than their portraits might suggest. And in noticing this, we notice ourselves, perhaps tucking in a little closer under the blanket, listening a little more quietly, letting the stories drift like snow through the night. Now, let's drift over to the Habsburgs, because they perfected something that other royal families merely dabbled in, the art of marrying cousins, until even the family portrait looked like a mildly confusing Rorschach test. They were, in historical terms, extraordinarily persistent in their pursuit of keeping power in the family, which, naturally, had a number of unintended consequences. Charles II of Spain, whom we've already briefly met, is a particularly gentle illustration of this. He was the end product of generations of careful, precise cousin marriages. His jaw, often described as the Habsburg jaw, was so pronounced that it made eating difficult, and in polite company, swallowing anything without grimacing could be considered a minor miracle. He suffered from a variety of other medical issues as well, but he was, historically, remarkably patient with these minor inconveniences. His advisors less so. They fretted constantly, unsure whether he would survive long enough to continue the dynasty. And he did, for 49 years, in a state of what might politely be called fragile endurance. The Habsburgs' obsession with marrying their own blood produced some very strange household situations. Imagine a dinner table where every cousin has a slightly odd cough or lisp, where conversation occasionally falters over questions of inheritance, and where the slightest sneeze is met with a flurry of handkerchiefs and a dramatic sigh. Life in these households was a careful ballet of etiquette, illness, and occasional whispers about who might have contracted what from whom. Meanwhile, let's drift over to the Stuarts of Britain, because they had their own flair for combining misfortune and stubbornness. Charles I, for instance, was a king with a taste for the theatrical and a tragic disregard for political practicality. He loved his robes, his collars, and particularly long tense silences during parliamentary sessions. Unfortunately for him, Parliament was not particularly inclined to enjoy these silences, which eventually led to a civil war. Charles was eventually executed, because, of course, he was. And in case you're wondering, he had children who grew up largely confined by tradition, illness, and the looming shadow of political instability. His son, Charles II, survived the upheaval, largely by spending years in exile and occasionally indulging in mildly scandalous behavior, like fathering numerous illegitimate children and generally enjoying life with a wink and a nod to propriety, or at least to the idea of it. He became king, restored the monarchy, and ruled in a style that historians describe as charmingly indulgent, which, in modern terms, might translate to not particularly good at making decisions, but delightful to have around at parties. Across the continent, in Russia, we encounter Peter the Great, a man who might have been better suited to a long, quiet life of carpentry and slightly obsessive calendar keeping. Instead, he decided to modernize Russia. This involved a great deal of coercion, including the occasional mildly terrifying military drill for his nobles, who were not particularly accustomed to hard work or cold water. Peter's personal habits were strange by any standard. He enjoyed building ships, walking long distances in disguise, and occasionally drilling his courtiers in military maneuvers while they wandered. If they had somehow wandered into a very unpleasant dream, Peter's family life was, unsurprisingly, tumultuous. He married multiple times, executed at least one son for political convenience, and generally made sure that the next generation would be both educated and terrified. His approach to parenting could be politely described as thorough, which is another way of saying his children grew up simultaneously brilliant and petrified. We can drift back a little westward to France to examine Louis XV, who inherited the throne as a child. His life was defined by illnesses, distant parenting, and a court that existed largely to remind him how magnificent he was. He spent decades indulging in affairs, gambling, and increasingly elaborate ceremonies while France's economy quietly staggered under the weight of debt. His children, of course, were delicate, sickly, and, in some cases, tragically unaware of basic survival skills because in the grand tradition of French royalty, instruction in etiquette was far more rigorous than instruction in, say, not catching smallpox. Louis XV's granddaughter, Marie Antoinette, whom we mentioned briefly before, lived in the opulent and stifling world of Versailles. Her childhood had been carefully constructed by tutors and governesses who were, in many ways, more concerned with proper posture and reciting prayers than with basic emotional development. She learned early that appearances mattered more than substance, which in the long run left her charming, stylish, and spectacularly unprepared for a revolution. Let's drift over to the Italian peninsula, where the Medici family had a flair for both brilliance and tragedy. They were financiers, patrons of the arts, and sometimes awkwardly sickly rulers. One of the Medici, Francesco I, had a fascination with alchemy, which, historically speaking, was the equivalent of spending a fortune on elaborate science experiments that produced very little except occasional mild explosions. His court had a strange elegance, largely because the Medici had money, but also a faint sense of dread because alchemical accidents were apparently not uncommon. The Medici children, like most royal children, were often delicate and overmanaged. Tutors insisted on rigorous schedules, medical advice ranged from slightly helpful to vaguely terrifying, and the household staff moved with a quiet desperation, knowing that one misstep could be fatal to both reputation and, occasionally, life. In such households, one quickly learned that appearances, rather than reality, were paramount. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, Suleiman the Magnificent ruled with a mixture of efficiency, paranoia, and personal indulgence. His harem, his court, and his children all contributed to a fascinatingly complicated household dynamic. Princes were educated rigorously, often in isolation and occasionally executed for perceived disloyalty. Daughters, conversely, were married strategically, which is to say, in ways that maximized the political utility of alliances rather than personal happiness. Family life here was not gentle. It was meticulously calculated, often harsh, but somehow managed to produce an empire that lasted for centuries. Back in England, Queen Victoria presided over a very different kind of royal household. Her children were numerous, and she was famously strict, often sending them away to distant schools and boarding arrangements while she ruled the empire with a combination of moral rigor and occasional melancholy. Her insistence on propriety extended to her grandchildren, many of whom married within the European royal web, continuing the slightly concerning trend of cousinly unions. These arrangements sometimes produced physically or emotionally fragile offspring, which, in the long run, became a recurring pattern across Europe's royal families. And then there is the fascinating world of child monarchs. Children who inherited thrones often did so before they had learned the basics of personal hygiene, let alone governance. Edward VI of England, for instance, became king at 9. His household staff was large, well-meaning, and deeply concerned with propriety, while he himself was plagued by ill health and the occasional outbreak of smallpox or measles. Yet he was expected to make decisions with the gravitas of a fully grown adult, which, predictably, did not always go well. His reign was short, partly due to illness and partly due to the harsh realities of being a child surrounded by ambitious adults. Even in Scandinavia, royalty had their moments of peculiar misfortune. Christian VII of Denmark, for instance, is remembered largely for his mental instability and the way it reshaped the Danish court. His advisors, naturally, had to step in constantly, governing in his name while he wandered through bouts of eccentricity that might include randomly deciding that he was someone else entirely. His marriage, of course, was arranged, producing a queen who was young, fearful, and largely ignored until political necessity intervened. So, as we sit in our imagined snowbound home, watching the fire sputter and listening to the wind outside, we can appreciate these historical oddities without needing to resolve them. Royal children wrapped too tightly, kings fainting from minor discomfort, queens judged endlessly for behavior that would be considered normal elsewhere. Bloodlines complicated by cousinly unions, palaces filled with the sounds of coughing, whispering, and occasionally fainting. And all of this unfolds slowly, gently in a world where appearances matter, survival is sometimes precarious. And the next generation is always carefully, if ineffectively, prepared for the weight of history. We can drift next into the more extreme examples of European inbreeding, the tragic consequences of dynastic obsession, and the strange personal quirks of rulers who were often brilliant, sometimes cruel, and always profoundly human. Because in these tales, the absurd and the tragic exist side by side, and observing them quietly is oddly comforting, like listening to snow fall outside a slightly cracked window, knowing that the world continues, no matter how delicate or ridiculous its inhabitants may be. Now, as we settle further into the gentle rhythm of history, let us drift into some of the more extreme consequences of dynastic obsession, those moments when keeping it in the family became a slightly tragic hobby. Spain's Habsburg line offers a particularly illustrative example. Charles II of Spain, whom we have met in passing, deserves a longer, quieter look. He was the final Habsburg king of Spain, a man whose existence was carefully managed by generations of cousin marriages. He had a jaw so pronounced that it interfered with eating, speech, and the occasional kiss, which, one might imagine, makes for a somewhat awkward courtly life. His body was frail, his mind slow, and yet he ruled more or less because there was nobody else. Courtiers whispered, doctors fretted, and family members occasionally sighed at the difficulty of keeping him alive long enough to manage dynastic concerns. He lived for 49 years, which is perhaps the longest endurance test any royal could hope for, given the circumstances. The Spanish Habsburgs were not unique in this obsessive marriage practice. Many European families followed suit, believing that political alliances were more important than robust genetics. The result was often a delicate cocktail of physical ailments, mental fragility, and strange quirks. For instance, in Austria, the Habsburgs continued this pattern with astonishing diligence. They sometimes called it dynastic duty, historians sometimes call it tragedy, and casual observers at the time likely called it a mildly perplexing parade of children with unusual jawlines and frequent colds. Meanwhile, let's drift northward to Russia, where the Romanovs cultivated a dynasty that was simultaneously brilliant and slightly terrifying. Peter the Great, as we've mentioned, had a fascination with modernization, drilling his nobles into shape and occasionally terrifying anyone who dared step too close. His descendants inherited both his brilliance and his peculiar temperaments. Catherine the Great, for example, married into the Romanov line and became, eventually, one of Russia's most celebrated rulers. She was intelligent, politically astute, and exceptionally skilled at managing the delicate balance between public image and private ambition. Her children, however, were a mixed bag. Some were competent, some were troubled, and some were quietly ignored until the weight of dynastic expectation could no longer be avoided. And then there's the minor royalty, those princes and princesses who were never quite in line for the throne but lived as if the world were eternally watching. Their lives were filled with tutors, strict schedules, and occasional moments of indulgence. One Austrian archduke reportedly enjoyed cataloguing insects with obsessive precision, while another spent long afternoons meticulously cleaning his library, imagining that order could somehow control the chaos of inheritance. Their personal quirks were tolerated, mostly because they were harmless and sometimes quietly mocked behind closed doors by siblings or servants. Let's take a breath and drift across the channel to the Stuarts again. James II of England was a king whose personal habits and religious preferences caused considerable discomfort among his subjects. He had a taste for ceremony, a preference for absolutism, and, unfortunately, a penchant for producing heirs who were either Catholic or extremely delicate. His reign was brief, turbulent, and ended with exile because, naturally, the country was not inclined to accommodate these personal predilections. His children fared no better in terms of political calm. The younger James, known historically as the Old Pretender, spent much of his life in exile, a man with royal blood but limited practical influence. Meanwhile, his siblings maneuvered through European courts with the same mixture of delicacy, charm, and mild incompetence that seemed to run in every royal family at the time. Back in France, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette provide another quiet study in tragic incongruity. He was gentle, indecisive, and deeply concerned with mechanical curiosities. He loved locks, watches, and anything that could be taken apart and studied. She was extravagant, fashionable, and, by necessity, politically astute, though her advice was often ignored. Their household, like many others, contained children who were fragile, shy, and heavily tutored, growing up in a world that demanded appearances over comfort, performance over health, and ceremony over play. And so we drift into the smaller, quieter disasters. Royals who were more concerned with minor personal comforts than the state, children swaddled or tutored to exhaustion, and households filled with the low, constant hum of illness, gossip, and whispered anxieties. These moments may not make for dramatic battle stories or scandalous headlines, but they reveal a surprisingly human, if slightly absurd, side of history. Even in Germany, where minor principalities were crammed into a confusing patchwork, we find the same patterns. Dukes and princes lived in small, meticulously managed courts. Their children were overeducated, often sickly, and generally expected to follow precise schedules that left little room for spontaneous fun. One duke reportedly insisted that his sons practice riding in full armor for hours on end, even when the ground was slippery with frost. The boys were perfectly polite, perfectly exhausted, and perfectly miserable. Their tutors, of course, took careful notes, knowing that history might one day judge their diligence, though probably not with sympathy. In Scandinavia, we find kings with eccentricities that drifted between charming and inconvenient. Christian VII of Denmark, mentioned before, spent periods convinced he was someone else entirely. His advisors handled this with a mixture of fear, patience, and polite resignation, and his queen, Caroline Matilda, navigated the court's intrigues with the quiet skill of someone who knew it was safer to observe than to act. Their children grew up aware that royal life required both flexibility and endurance, and sometimes neither was particularly useful in everyday life. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire's Suleiman the Magnificent combined extraordinary military and administrative skill with a family life that could be described as both intricate and slightly terrifying. Princes were often secluded, educated rigorously, and occasionally executed to prevent potential power struggles. Daughters were married strategically, producing alliances that often resembled a complicated chessboard more than a family tree. The court itself was a mixture of brilliance, paranoia, and gentle absurdity, a place where the smallest mistake could ripple outward in unexpected ways. And so we drift once more into the quiet absurdities, minor illnesses that delayed coronations, princes obsessed with trivial hobbies, queens endlessly criticized for indulgences that were mostly harmless. In these corridors of history, human fragility and social expectation intersect in ways that are simultaneously sad, amusing, and oddly comforting. One imagines a faintly chilly room, a fire sputtering in the hearth, and the faint echo of a royal sigh that says, "Yes, I am expected to be perfect, and yes, I am very tired." These stories are not dramatic in the modern sense. There are no cliffhangers, no grand revelations, just the gentle unfolding of lives that were managed, constrained, and occasionally overwhelmed by the weight of tradition. And in observing them quietly, we can imagine ourselves in that same slow rhythm, watching, breathing, and letting the gentle absurdities of human ambition and fragility lull us into a reflective, almost meditative state. From here we could drift toward even more unusual examples. Royals who collected insects, who insisted on bathing at specific times, who arranged furniture according to secret patterns, or who spent hours counting coins as a form of personal amusement. These habits may seem trivial, but they illuminate the delicate, strange, and often lonely worlds of the people whose lives were intertwined with crowns, bloodlines, and expectations that were sometimes impossible to meet. And as we continue, we notice a pattern across Europe, across centuries, across dynasties. The combination of fragile health, obsession with appearances, and insistence on keeping it all in the family created a world both absurd and tragic. Kings and queens, princes and princesses, tutors, advisors, and servants all moving in carefully choreographed ways, trying to maintain stability in a world that often refused to be stable. We are not rushing. We are not chasing scandal. We are simply observing, breathing, and letting these stories drift past like snowflakes outside a frosty window, each one unique, delicate, and slightly baffling. As we continue our drift through history, let's pause and look at the small, peculiar details that often defined royal life. Not battles, not treaties, but the quiet, almost absurd routines and obsessions that shaped entire households. Because, of course, even kings and queens in all their grandeur were subject to human quirks. Take the Romanovs again, for instance. Peter the Great's descendants were a fascinating mix of brilliance and instability. Catherine the Great ruled with intelligence and a certain practical ruthlessness, yet her household contained children and grandchildren whose health and temperament ranged from delicate to downright unpredictable. The Russian court was a place where people were constantly aware that fortune, illness, and an ill-timed sneeze could alter the course of a dynasty. Some of these children, raised in immense palaces with strict tutors, developed peculiar habits. One princess reportedly collected insects obsessively, labeling them with Latin names and arranging them according to color and size. Another prince meticulously counted coins every morning before breakfast, convinced that miscounting could foreshadow political instability. In hindsight, these habits are charmingly harmless, but at the time they were considered markers of character, or sometimes cause for concern. Across Europe, similar quirks abound. In France, Louis XIV's court became a stage for endless, carefully choreographed absurdities. Courtiers fainted politely, whispered incessantly, and spent hours adjusting collars and ribbons. Louis himself was not immune. He insisted on elaborate routines from bathing to dressing, which could take hours. He loved etiquette so much that it was practically a sport. The Sun King shone brightly, and everyone around him spent decades trying not to trip over their own ceremonial robes. Meanwhile, in Spain, the decline of the Habsburgs continued quietly, tragically, and with a certain awkwardness. Charles II's health problems, both physical and cognitive, made governance challenging. Advisors suggested reforms, family members fretted, and the king's jaw remained an ever-present symbol of dynastic consequences. His life was slow, careful, and meticulously managed, like a fragile glass ornament that everyone feared would shatter if handled too roughly. We can drift to England again, where the Hanoverians had their own set of eccentricities. George III, the famously mad king, experienced periods of mental instability, which required Parliament to step in. He was deeply attached to routine, personal gardening, and occasionally conversing with the royal cows, because naturally one needs comfort somewhere. His children were numerous, fragile, and largely tutored under strict supervision. Some developed health issues, others temperament quirks, but all were expected to maintain the dignity of the crown while quietly suffering under the expectations imposed upon them. Even the minor royals had remarkable oddities. In Germany, dukes and princes lived in tightly controlled courts, with staff trained to anticipate every whim. Some children developed extreme timidity, others obsessive habits, and a few simply retreated into quiet, solitary pursuits. One prince spent entire afternoons arranging his shoes in precise geometric patterns, convinced that disruption could portend political disaster. Another meticulously studied arithmetic to the point that tutors worried he might forget basic human interaction. These may seem trivial now, but at the time they mattered profoundly. In Scandinavia, the eccentricities of kings continued. Christian VII of Denmark, who sometimes believed he was another person entirely, kept advisors in a state of gentle panic. His queen, Caroline Matilda, managed what she could with quiet skill, understanding that observation often worked better than intervention. Their children grew up aware that royal life demanded endurance, patience, and sometimes complete detachment from personal desire. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, Suleiman the Magnificent's family routines combined rigorous education, strict hierarchy, and occasional ruthless practicality. Princes were secluded and educated, sometimes at the cost of personal happiness. Daughters married strategically, forming alliances that were less about affection and more about political advantage. And yet, in quieter moments, the court staff might observe a prince quietly tending a garden, or a daughter secretly practicing embroidery. Small glimpses of humanity amidst vast power and strict protocol. Back in Italy, the Medici family continued to demonstrate that even wealth and influence could not prevent fragile domestic life. Francesco I's fascination with alchemy produced minor explosions, fumes, and occasional nervousness among servants. His children, like others of their class, were carefully educated, overmanaged, and frequently ill. Tutors emphasized decorum over comfort, which produced households that were orderly but often tense. And yet somehow art flourished, architecture grew, and culture thrived amid these quiet domestic absurdities. In England again, Queen Victoria's descendants extended this pattern into the 19th century. She insisted on strict moral and educational routines for her children and grandchildren. Cousin marriages persisted, producing minor physical and psychological vulnerabilities. Yet she ruled an empire, sending her children into carefully arranged marriages across Europe, each union chosen to preserve political influence rather than personal happiness. History gently whispers that some of these marriages produced offspring with the predictable fragilities of generations long, accustomed to inbreeding and overmanagement. And as we drift, it is worth noting that much of this history unfolds quietly. There are no dramatic battles here, no sudden reversals, only the slow, meticulous unfolding of fragile human lives constrained by duty, appearance, and fragile health. A prince counts coins, a princess collects insects, a king paces quietly, and a queen worries about her children's posture. These are the gentle rhythms of history, the quiet oddities that, if observed slowly, become strangely comforting in their predictability. The faint patterns of fragility, eccentricity, and careful management stretch across centuries. Whether in Spain, France, Russia, England, Germany, or the Ottoman Empire, the combination of fragile bloodlines, rigid etiquette, and eccentric personal habits produced households that were simultaneously absurd, tragic, and deeply human. Royal life, for all its grandeur, was often a slow, meticulous negotiation between expectation and endurance. And so, as the fire sputters softly in our imagined snowbound house, we observe these small historical details with gentle curiosity. The swaddled children, the fainting courtiers, the princes obsessed with arithmetic, the queens arranging hair in impossible styles, all moving through lives, carefully managed yet inevitably touched by fragility. The world outside may be harsh, unpredictable, and cold, but inside these historical households, life unfolds in patterns both meticulous and absurd, like snowflakes drifting silently from the sky. And in noticing these small absurdities, we can perhaps feel a measure of calm. For no matter how delicate the bloodlines, how obsessive the habits, or how fragile the children, history continues its slow, rhythmic passage. Each story, each quirk, and each quiet misfortune becomes part of the gentle tapestry that surrounds us tonight, as we drift along with it, softly, slowly, like the snow against the window pane. Let's begin with the Spanish Habsburgs again. By now you may recall Charles II, whose jawline had become a kind of family legend as well as a practical challenge. But beyond the medical and dynastic consequences, there's a gentler, quieter rhythm to observe. Imagine him in his chambers, carefully eating, slowly working through the letters that arrived from various advisors. Each one weighed for content, tone, and potential offense. Courtiers whispered constantly around him, offering advice that was often contradictory, while family members fretted quietly in corners, fearing the fragile balance of health, etiquette, and succession could be tipped by the smallest misstep. Even in these moments, there is something almost comforting about the regularity. Despite the frailty, the carefully managed routines create a sense of order. Meals are served at precise times, letters are read under soft candlelight, and the king's faint sighs become a gentle backdrop to the minor ongoing dramas of courtly life. One might imagine the snow outside the windows, drifting silently past, as if even nature understands the need for calm. Crossing over to France, Louis XIV's court continues to fascinate. The Sun King, known for his obsession with routine, is in his private chambers. Robes and lace arranged perfectly, perfumes carefully applied. Courtiers flit around him, adjusting collars, holding fans, and practicing fainting at the slightest provocation. Children are observed by tutors who record every gesture and word, noting potential strengths or weaknesses in future heirs. Here, the absurd and the meticulous merge into a daily ballet, a quiet choreography of power, appearance, and minor eccentricities. And then, gently drifting north to England, we see George III, whose famed madness is, in reality, a series of delicate health issues mixed with a fondness for routine and quiet personal habits. He tends his gardens, converses gently with animals, and watches his children practice music or arithmetic under the supervision of tutors. The household hums with the quiet rhythm of instruction, observation, and gentle oversight. Children, fragile and often unwell, learn the art of polite conversation, posture, and composure in a world where every misstep could have social or political consequences. Meanwhile, in Russia, Peter the Great's influence persists in the careful education and supervision of his descendants. Catherine the Great, intelligent and politically skilled, manages her household with a balance of ruthlessness and routine. Her children and grandchildren are educated rigorously, yet their health and temperament vary. Some are clever and composed, others delicate or shy, yet all must navigate the careful choreography of courtly life. In quiet moments, one might imagine a princess labeling insects or a prince counting coins, small gestures of order and control in a world that is otherwise unpredictable. Back in Germany, the minor princes and dukes live lives that might seem comically meticulous from a distance. Shoes arranged in perfect patterns, arithmetic practiced until fingers ache, hours spent riding in armor despite frost or snow. Their households are filled with tutors, servants, and courtiers, all quietly ensuring that the next generation maintains decorum, knowledge, and the appearance of composure. The routines are long, repetitive, and slightly absurd, yet they create a framework within which fragile humans navigate their limited autonomy. In Scandinavia, Christian VII's eccentricities bring both anxiety and quiet amusement to the Danish court. His periods of believing himself to be someone else entirely are managed with patience by his advisors and careful observation by his queen. The children learn early that royal life requires endurance, flexibility, and a certain detachment from personal desire. Their education is rigorous, their health monitored meticulously, and their daily routines structured to maintain as much stability as possible. Across the Ottoman Empire, Suleiman the Magnificent balances power, strategy, and family management. Princes are secluded, educated, and occasionally disciplined harshly, while daughters are married strategically to secure alliances. Yet, within the walls of Topkapi Palace, there are quiet moments, a prince tending a small garden, a daughter practicing embroidery, servants quietly moving between rooms. These moments reveal the human fragility beneath layers of protocol, power, and expectation. Even in Italy, the Medici family demonstrates that wealth does not exempt a household from the slow, persistent rhythms of delicate life. Francesco I's interest in alchemy leads to small explosions and nervous servants, while children are overmanaged, educated strictly, and sometimes ill. The household hums with meticulous care, balancing art, science, decorum, and domestic fragility in a way that seems almost meditative when observed slowly. In England, Queen Victoria's descendants continue the pattern into the 19th century. Children and grandchildren are educated under strict moral and practical guidance. Cousin marriages continue, producing minor physical and psychological vulnerabilities. And yet, amidst all this careful control, the empire continues to function. Children learn their place, marriages are arranged, and life moves forward with slow, deliberate certainty. And so, as we sit in our imagined snowbound house, the fire sputtering softly, the wind whispering outside, we can appreciate these quiet eccentricities. Children swaddled, princes counting coins, princesses cataloging insects, kings pacing slowly, queens adjusting hair or posture. All these small, gentle moments make up the quieter, less obvious fabric of history. There are no battles tonight, no grand events. Just the delicate, repetitive rhythms of fragile human lives constrained by duty, expectation, and the faint unpredictability of health. The pattern becomes clear. Across centuries, continents, and dynasties, the combination of fragile health, meticulous education, and obsessive routines created households that were simultaneously absurd, delicate, and deeply human. Observing them slowly, as if watching snow fall outside a window, brings a gentle, reflective calm. And as we drift, we notice that these minor oddities, the counting, the cataloging, the fainting, the pacing, are more than curiosities. They are reminders that even the most powerful are, at their core, subject to time, fragility, and small human quirks. Life continues, slowly, rhythmically, gently, whether in a frost-covered palace, a snowbound cabin, or the quiet corners of your own evening. So let us lean back, breathe slowly, and let these soft, historical oddities drift past quietly, like snowflakes settling on the frozen landscape outside, reminding us that even in grandeur, life is often fragile, eccentric, and profoundly human. Let's begin in Spain again with the Habsburg line. Charles II is the familiar figure, whose jaw and delicate body were the product of generations of cousin marriages. But the story doesn't stop at him. His ancestors meticulously married cousins to consolidate power, producing children who were often frail, slow to develop, or unusually delicate. In the quiet corridors of palaces, these children were watched closely by tutors, nurses, and courtiers, all tasked with ensuring survival, health, and propriety. Every meal, every walk in the garden, every lesson in etiquette or Latin was observed, measured, and recorded. The air was thick with the quiet tension of fragility, yet life moved forward in slow, deliberate rhythm. Meanwhile, in Austria, the Habsburgs continued their careful obsession. Children were often pale, sickly, and prone to minor ailments that might seem inconsequential to an outsider, but were treated as matters of grave importance. Imagine a young archduke swaddled tightly against drafts, counting coins as if his diligence could stave off illness. Or a princess, quietly arranging her needlework, her hands steady despite the faintest shiver from cold or weakness. The palaces themselves seemed to hold their breath, as if aware that any misstep might tip the delicate balance of bloodline and duty. Drifting northward, the Romanovs in Russia had their own rhythms of fragility and control. Peter the Great's children were educated with intensity, exposed to harsh drills, and sometimes made to fear the consequences of small mistakes. Catherine the Great later continued the pattern, ruling with intelligence and decisiveness, while overseeing children whose health and temperament were highly variable. Some were clever, some timid, some simply fragile. Tutors meticulously recorded behaviors. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors. And the children themselves learned early that survival required obedience, endurance, and careful attention to the smallest social cues. In England, the Stuarts offer another gentle study in dynastic misfortune. Charles I, remembered for his tragic end, raised children in a world of ritualized instruction, political tension, and intermittent danger. Charles II, having survived exile, grew up under similar constraints, navigating foreign courts, distant relatives, and the occasional scandal with a mix of charm and exhaustion. Each child, each household followed its own rhythm, quietly repeating patterns of fragility and careful management that echoed across generations. France, once again, provides a vivid illustration. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's children were raised in a court of opulent strictness, where lessons were precise, schedules rigid, and illnesses frequent. The fragile health of these children was observed with polite concern, sometimes with fear and often with helplessness. Swaddled, tutored, and monitored constantly, they learned the art of stillness, decorum, and quiet endurance, skills which, sadly, were of little use when revolution came to the doors of Versailles. Even in Germany, where minor principalities created tightly controlled courts, childhood was often more structured than playful. Princes and princesses were taught arithmetic, etiquette, music, and history with exacting precision. One might imagine a young duke spending hours in snow-covered stables, practicing horsemanship in full armor, his body stiff from frost and exertion, while tutors noted posture, focus, and compliance. In these small, meticulously managed moments, fragility and diligence coexisted quietly, like frost on palace windows, beautiful, delicate, and inevitable. Scandinavia, too, offers glimpses of fragile royalty. Christian VII of Denmark, already prone to periods of eccentricity, oversaw a court where children were observed constantly, their health and temperament managed meticulously. Caroline Matilda, his queen, maneuvered carefully, understanding that observation often worked better than direct intervention. Royal children grew up learning endurance, detachment, and the quiet skill of anticipating the world's expectations, lessons that were often protective, if slightly isolating. Across the Ottoman Empire, princes and princesses experienced childhood under strict protocol and careful supervision. Princes studied rigorously, sometimes in isolation, while daughters were prepared for strategic marriages that often prioritized politics over personal happiness. Yet small human moments existed. A prince tending a garden, a princess quietly practicing embroidery, servants moving silently to maintain comfort. Even amidst strict routine and expectation, these glimpses of personal freedom added subtle warmth to otherwise meticulously managed lives. Italy's Medici family provides another quiet example of fragile aristocratic childhoods. Francesco I's fascination with alchemy produced minor explosions, fumes, and nervous servants, while children were educated strictly in decorum and manners. They were often ill, overmanaged, and guided by tutors who prioritized proper conduct over comfort. Yet art flourished, architecture grew, and culture thrived within these fragile domestic routines, demonstrating that even eccentricity and fragility could coexist with brilliance. In England, Queen Victoria extended the patterns of strict management and careful oversight well into the 19th century. Her children and grandchildren were numerous, carefully educated, and frequently married within the family to preserve political influence. Fragile health, obsessive education, and meticulously maintained routines produced descendants who were delicate, often eccentric, yet disciplined. Their lives moved at a measured pace, slow and meticulous, echoing the rhythms of earlier centuries. Finally, we can consider child monarchs across Europe, whose lives were delicate exercises in endurance. Edward VI of England became king at 9, navigating instruction, illness, and political expectations simultaneously. Other child rulers like the young Louis XIV or Christian VII faced similar pressures. Their days were filled with tutors, lessons, and ceremonial observation, with little room for spontaneous play or choice. Fragility was a constant companion, as was the delicate, slow unfolding of education and etiquette designed to prepare them for responsibilities they might not yet understand. Through all of these examples, a pattern emerges. Across dynasties, continents, and centuries, childhood among royalty was defined by careful observation, meticulous education, delicate health, and subtle eccentricity. Children counted coins, arranged shoes, cataloged insects, practiced music, and endured long hours of instruction, all within a rhythm that was slow, quiet, and persistent. Fragile bodies, obsessive routines, and careful supervision were constant, creating households that were simultaneously absurd, poignant, and deeply human. And so, as we sit in our imagined snowbound cabin, the fire sputtering softly, we can imagine these lives unfolding. Swaddled children, pacing kings, tutored princes, quietly industrious princesses, and courtiers moving softly through shadowed halls. History in these moments is not grand or violent, but delicate, absurd, and gentle, a tapestry of fragility, routine, and human eccentricity that drifts past like snowflakes outside a frosted window. The slow, quiet rhythm continues, carrying us gently through time, from fragile Habsburgs to delicate Romanovs, from meticulously tutored Hanoverians to eccentric Danish princes. Each story, each observation is a soft, Reflective note in the Symphony of History, a reminder that even those who seem the most powerful are often, at their core, governed by fragility, routine, and the subtle, quiet absurdities of daily life. Let's start with a familiar family, the Habsburgs. By now, we know the story of Charles II of Spain, whose jaw was both a practical challenge and a symbol of dynastic obsession. But consider the daily lives of his ancestors. Children were meticulously monitored, educated in Latin, etiquette, and history, and often swaddled or isolated to prevent illness. Minor coughs, slight fevers, or even the occasional sneeze became events to be recorded and treated with solemn attention. Every meal was carefully measured, every walk observed. Life was a slow rhythm of minor triumphs and constant, delicate management. In Austria, the Habsburg children exhibited a variety of eccentricities, some charming, some slightly tragic. One archduke reportedly spent hours arranging his slippers in precise geometric patterns, convinced that disorder could portend political disaster. A young princess catalogued flowers with meticulous notes in Latin, believing that botanical order mirrored the harmony of the empire. Tutors and courtiers quietly tolerated or documented these habits, understanding that the fragile balance of bloodline and behavior required careful observation and intervention. Drifting to France, Louis XIV's court provides another landscape of meticulous, almost absurd rituals. Courtiers spent hours preparing, practicing fainting, whispering etiquette, adjusting collars, or demonstrating proper posture. The Sun King himself adhered to routines so precise that bathing, dressing, and ceremonial participation could take hours each day. Children in this environment absorbed the importance of appearances, endurance, and meticulous social performance, while still navigating fragile health and occasional minor illnesses. Life moved slowly, punctuated by carefully choreographed gestures, polite sighs, and whispered observations. In England, George III provides a gentle contrast. While periods of mental instability required parliamentary oversight, his personal habits were quieter, tending gardens, observing weather, and occasionally conversing with livestock for comfort. His children, numerous and delicate, learned to navigate both instruction and illness with patience. Some developed temperamental quirks, others fragile health, but all were expected to maintain composure and dignity. The household hum of routine, care, and observation persisted, a soft background to the broader currents of empire. Meanwhile, in Russia, Peter the Great and his descendants created households where intelligence, endurance, and meticulous supervision intertwined. Catherine the Great continued this pattern, raising children who were clever, timid, or fragile, and always observed. One might imagine a princess quietly sewing by candlelight, a prince counting coins before breakfast, all under the careful gaze of tutors and courtiers. Small obsessions provided structure in an otherwise unpredictable world. The Stuarts of England offer their own quietly fascinating quirks. Charles' children grew up under tight instruction, often in tension-filled households. Charles II, after exile, spent much of his youth navigating foreign courts, indulging in small pleasures, and charming as he went. Yet his siblings experienced the same meticulous oversight, fragile health, and subtle social pressures that threaded through every European royal household. In Germany, minor princes and dukes cultivated habits that, viewed slowly, resemble quiet, meditative rituals. Hours of arithmetic practice, perfectly aligned shoes, and meticulously arranged libraries were not eccentricities for amusement, they were attempts to maintain control in a world governed by expectations and fragile health. Tutors monitored every move, recording behaviors that might reflect future competence or, quietly, signal potential failings. Life here is measured, deliberate, and careful, a slow rhythm that is as much protective as it is absurd. Scandinavia provides further examples of quiet eccentricity. Christian VII of Denmark, prone to believing he was someone else entirely, lived in a court perpetually balancing fear, patience, and subtle amusement. His queen, Caroline Matilde, navigated these rhythms with quiet skill, understanding that observation often worked better than intervention. Children learned early that endurance, flexibility, and the gentle suppression of personal desires were necessary survival skills. The Ottoman Empire's Suleiman, the magnificent blended discipline, hierarchy, and occasional ruthlessness with subtler domestic rituals. Princes were secluded, rigorously educated, and occasionally disciplined harshly. Daughters were married strategically, alliances carefully measured. Yet in quieter corners, a prince might tend a garden, a princess practice embroidery, and servants quietly maintain comfort. Even in vast, tightly controlled systems, small human habits provided rhythm, stability, and occasional solace. In Italy, the Medici family continued to demonstrate that domestic life, even amidst wealth and influence, could be both delicate and peculiar. Francesco I's interest in alchemy produced minor explosions and nervous staff, while children were overmanaged, educated strictly in decorum, and frequently ill. Hours were spent observing, cataloging, or performing small, meticulous tasks activities that balanced curiosity with endurance. Life here moved slowly, punctuated by delicate rituals and minor, manageable catastrophes. Queen Victoria's children and grandchildren in England carried forward this pattern into the 19th century. They were numerous, carefully educated, and often married within the family. Fragile health, obsessive attention to education and moral instruction, and meticulous daily routines created households where minor quirks could flourish alongside careful control. Children learned endurance, patience, and the subtle art of navigating fragile expectations, often quietly observing the adults' precise behaviors as a model for their own lives. Even minor catastrophes, illnesses that delayed instruction, fainting episodes during ceremonies, or a poorly timed sneeze in the presence of a monarch were integrated into the slow rhythm of life. These small events, gentle disruptions, required management, adjustment, and careful observation. The household moved forward, deliberately, like snow piling slowly on a quiet roof. And so, in our imagined snowbound cabin, we can observe these minor eccentricities and quiet catastrophes as part of the soft, persistent rhythm of history. Swaddled children counting coins, meticulous princes arranging shoes, princesses cataloging insects, kings pacing slowly, queens adjusting hairstyles, courtiers whispering, and servants moving silently. These moments together form a tapestry of human fragility, endurance, and curiosity. Across Europe and beyond, we notice a pattern: fragile health, meticulous routines, obsessive habits, and careful observation. Life moves slowly, deliberately, with quiet catastrophes punctuating long stretches of ordinary management. And as we drift along with these stories, we realize that even the most powerful, most celebrated, most majestic figures were, in private, subject to time, fragility, and the small absurdities of daily life. History, in these moments, is soft, unhurried, and reflective. There are no battles tonight, no political intrigue to chase, just the gentle unfolding of human lives, constrained by expectation, nurtured by ritual, and occasionally disrupted by illness or accident. Each story drifts past like snowflakes outside a frosted window, unique, delicate, and quietly remarkable. We can settle here for a while, letting these tales of eccentricity and quiet fragility float past, softening the edges of the day and inviting a slower, more reflective awareness of the human experience, royal or otherwise.